Hello, everyone. Warm welcome. I'm John McArthur, Director and Senior Fellow of the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings. It's a pleasure to welcome you today to this public session on net zero commitments. What is needed from non-state entities to reach net zero emissions? In March of this year, the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change indicated that the window to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is about to disappear. Warming of at least 1.1 degrees Celsius has already taken place, and limiting warming to 1.5 degrees requires cutting greenhouse gas emissions nearly in half by 2030, only 7 years away. This implies rapid action and implementation toward net zero emissions by all stakeholders, government and non-government alike. Well, last November in 2022, a report from the UN high-level expert group on the net zero emissions commitments of non-state entities was issued under the title Integrity Matters. It outlined 10 key recommendations for bringing net zero commitments to life. The report was chaired by former Canadian Minister of Environment and Climate, the Honourable McKenna. In a recap of the report, The Economist magazine lauded it and its chair as, quote, refreshingly direct, end quote, including her unequivocal statement in the opening of the report that it is time to draw a red line around greenwashing. We'll soon hear a keynote from McKenna in providing an update on the high-level expert group's work and follow-up. She will then join a panel moderated by my colleague Sanjay Petnaik, Director of the Center on Regulation and Markets and a Fellow in Economic Studies at Brookings, alongside Helen Mountford, President and CEO of Climate Works Foundation, and Karsten Stendebad, Co-CIO for Sustainability at Bridgewater Associates. I do want to be sure to mention that Bridgewater and Climate Works Foundation have provided financial support to Brookings, and as a nonprofit organization, we greatly appreciate their support. Of course, one of the key features of Brookings is our independence, and all of the views expressed here today belong directly to our speakers and panelists themselves. Now, turning to our keynote speaker. The Honourable McKenna is, as mentioned, former Canadian Minister for Environment and Climate, and of great relevance was then Minister for Infrastructure and Communities. Prior to going into politics, she practiced competition and trade law in Canada and Indonesia. In addition to chairing the UN expert group, she's currently a distinguished visiting fellow at Columbia University and founder and principal of Climate and Nature Solutions. Catherine is also, I have to say, a personal friend for many years and has been someone who has been a great inspiration to many of us in watching her take on these issues globally and nationally. In her role in Canada, in the government, she played a crucial role in the implementation of a national carbon pricing strategy. She played a crucial role in the expansion of protected areas, both maritime and on land. And she was vitally involved in a new policy to ban single-use plastics. When she was first elected to office in 2015, within a matter of days, she became a member of the so-called High Ambition Coalition going into the Paris Agreement, which led to the adoption of the ambition of 1.5 degrees global warming as a cap. She was later recognized by many around the world for her crucial role in making that High Ambition Coalition come to life in such a crucial moment for the Paris Agreement, which now stands nearly 8 years old and has defined so much of global cooperation for climate action ever since. It's a testament to her that she is still providing such leadership after her career in government on these issues, but moving outside of government to see what other actors need to do too. So, Catherine, it's a pleasure and honor to introduce you today, to have you speak about these issues on behalf of the UN high-level expert group, but really as an individual expert who has contributed so much leadership in so many dimensions of the global climate action fight. We're really thrilled to have you here today and look forward to your remarks. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, John. It's really great to be here. And thanks very much to Brookings for hosting. We have an amazing panel. And you and I have been friends from a really long time. We're also fellow Canadians, probably some Canadians watching there. A lot of Canadians working in the US and globally on climate. And I'm just thrilled to be talking about a topic that's critically important. Look, the good news, we always should start with some good news, is that 90% of global GDP is covered by net zero commitments. We are making progress in terms of the 1.5 degree target. So we're now a lot further along than we were in Paris, where we were above, I think we were going above 4.4 degrees. Now we're potentially at 2.4 degrees. And further if country commitments are actually implemented. But I think that's what we need to talk about is implementation, and we'll get there. But I mean, we've all seen the world's moving really quickly. So if in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, but also the bipartisan infrastructure bill, those were really game changers for the US. I think for US watchers, and I actually do a lot of work in the US with Columbia University, but also with some US businesses. I think we were a little worried looking at the US, whether you'd be able to make progress on climate, because it is challenging from a regulatory perspective. But that's a real game changer, because I mean, we need emissions go down, but we need money to flow to clean, and we need real incentives for, in particular, the business community. I mean, for everyone, but for the business community to act. And if you look at some stats, I mean, there's a ton of stats you can look at. You can look at cost curves when it comes to renewables. I'll just take one. In the past 7 years, annual clean energy investment has tripled. And we're on track to quadruple the investment by 2030. That's in particular US and EU policies, although of course Canada were important in this as well. But now the bad news. The bad news is we're still very far off being at 1.5 degrees of warming with our policies. And what is required. And I think it's really important, because some people want to negotiate with climate change. You can't negotiate with climate change. It's actually a science and physics issue. So we need to peak emissions by 2025, and that has become much harder by the illegal Russian war in Ukraine and the consequences of that. But also, I will say, some folks are taking advantage of that. And we need to reduce emissions by half by 2030. But I'm someone, John and I know each other from a number of things, but we're also competitive swimmers. So the way I would like to frame this, and everyone should think of this as I talk about what is required to be net zero, and there are clear requirements, is you got to have a stretch goal. So we can talk about being net zero by 2050, but 2050 is so far off. So if you're going to the Olympics, you're training like maybe 8 years ahead of time, or 4 years certainly. So you got to have targets that are short term and medium term, and you got to meet them. And then you got to adjust and innovate if you're not meeting them, and you got to work hard every day and no excuses. So that's what I'd like to get us in the mindset for when it comes to the report. So the report of the high-level expert group came out of the Secretary General's desire to ensure that it was very, very clear what it meant when folks said they were net zero or net zero aligned. By folks, I mean, non-state entities. So we use a lot of jargon in the climate world. I try to be just like a jargon-free person. So what are we talking about? Non-state actors or entities, we're really talking about businesses, financial institutions, cities, and regions. Because while countries need to take the lead, we obviously need non-state entities to actually be doing their work too, being consistent with net zero, but also pushing and creating an ambition loop with governments. And the Secretary General was also very clear, and you've probably seen, he does probably the best climate comms in terms of being very direct. There's greenwashing going on. And greenwashing is a real problem, because we all know the markets need to work with with information, good information. And right now it's very hard for investors. It's very hard for consumers. It's very hard for young people who are choosing jobs and what companies they want to work for that are clean. It's hard for pensioners to figure out who actually is committed to net zero. And as I said, net zero is measurable. So that's what I want to talk about. So with our report, there were 16 experts from around the world. We had former regulators, we had a CEO, we had members of the business community, we had scientists, we had activists. So it was actually a great cross-section, and also the most diverse It was gender balanced, which was something I was very happy to see, but also it had representation from around the world. Often does not happen in this context. So from Asia, China, Japan, India, as well as from Africa, from South America. So it was a great group. And we really just said, okay, net zero's got to mean something. And it does. So let there be no confusion, because I've worked in the corporate world, and the corporate world more than anything else wants certainty, and it wants ambition. So this is what needs to be seen, and the Secretary General has been clear that this is what the criteria are. But it also just builds on what Race to Zero set out, Science-Based Targets Initiative, GFAN. It's really building on existing initiatives. So what do you need to do if you want to be net zero aligned? You need to have a long-term science-based target based on 1.5 degree of warming, but you need to have short and medium-term targets as well. Remember I said you got to be held accountable, and we can't be talking about 2050. That's too far out. You need to have detailed transition plans. And as I said, it's all measurable. So what do we need? We need emissions to go down now, and we need money to go to clean at scale, moving from dirty to clean at scale now. And that means you need to actually make sure that your business plans, that your CapEx, all of that is aligned with your short and medium term targets, and you need to adjust if you're not making the progress you need. And there's a huge opportunity to innovate and create new business models. Always happy to talk about the huge opportunity of the transition that we're in. And then finally, you need to report publicly. You need to have verified comparable data. That's a big challenge right now, to find out comparable data. And in good news, President Macron and Michael Bloomberg, as well as a number of other folks, I'm part of the advisory committee, they will be launching with the UN a net zero data portal or utility. Not the sexiest name, but actually super important, because it's just going to have basic data so that everyone can see. It's going to be publicly available, comparable data. How are folks doing? When you say you're net zero, are you really on track? Are you reducing your emissions along with science? Is your CapEx going from dirty to clean? I think we need to just be holding folks to account, and that'll reward the high ambition folks. Because right now it's very hard, and I know it's hard in the US and other places, that there are other pressures, but we want to reward leadership. But there's some other things that were important to point out, because remember, the Secretary General was focused on greenwashing. So there's some things you cannot do and say that you're committed to net zero. You cannot invest in new fossil fuel infrastructure. That's just the science. That is what the IEA has said, the International Energy Agency. That's what the IPCC science shows. There's already a lot of investment out there in fossil fuel infrastructure. So we can't be investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure. And that also, you also can't be doing other environmentally destructive activities, in particular deforestation. I think that we've seen that there's a huge opportunity in Europe. They've made huge advances actually in leapfrogging where they were in terms of going from fossil fuels to clean. You cannot simply buy credits, often lacking in integrity, instead of cutting your own emissions across your value chain. There's good news. There's a lot of work going on to create high integrity voluntary carbon market. And I'll say that's very important. I was involved in the negotiations of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement on markets. But we really need to make sure that we're actually focused on reducing our emissions, and the opportunity to innovate, including along your value chain, to support your suppliers, or to ensure if you're an investor that you're focused on investing your money in clean. That is critically important. You cannot lobby against ambitious government action. Now, this is something that is a huge problem. I was Minister of Environment and Climate Change. People would listen to me, and then they go to the finance minister and say, don't do carbon pricing, or don't do low carbon fuel standard, or don't do whatever. You cannot put up your hand and say you're a climate leader and then be lobbying against policies would actually enable you as a business, a financial institution, city and region to actually do more. That's inconsistent, but also we need an ambition loop. And I'll give you a very quick example. So I was tasked by the Prime Minister not only of getting Canada's first national climate plan, but also as part of that plan, and really as a flagstone piece, was to land carbon pricing. That's hard. That was really hard. And I had environmentalists supporting me. Great. But one of the big challenges was, how did I make the case to Canadians, to businesses, this was a good thing. Well, I needed the corporate community to be aligned. So I created a high ambition coalition on carbon pricing, and I was able to get a few banks. And then guess what? There's a tipping point. So all Canadian banks joined on to say we needed carbon pricing. We had manufacturing companies, we had telecom companies, we had one oil and gas company. And that really helped to make the case that this was a way to reduce emissions in a way that was, actually the lowest cost way. We also were giving the money directly back, all of the money. So it was transparent. And we need good policies. And it's very hard as a policymaker sometimes to land climate policy. Sometimes it's the best. Well, most of the time it's actually really good policy. The problem is the politics. And so we do need leadership from folks. Well, they will step up and say, yes, actually, we're not going to lobby against this policy. We're going to publicly support this policy because we know we need to move to a cleaner future. It's going to make us more competitive rather than less. It's going to create business opportunities, but these policies will help us reduce our own emissions and do our part. And then the last recommendation we had, which is critically important, is we need to regulate. And I hear this from the business community, the need for regulation. Once again, support business leaders, support policy leaders who are trying to pass policies. But there's a competitiveness issue. I recognize that there's a lot of folks who aren't committed to net zero, particular privately owned companies. And we need to hold everyone to account, and there needs to be consequences because it's obviously in a voluntary space. It's a lot harder to have consequences. So I'm happy to go in more detail on this. I want to say two other things. One, you may have heard I'm a competition and antitrust lawyer. Well, reformed. I'm a recovering competition antitrust lawyer, recovering politician. But the good news is my worlds have collided. And so I am doing work with leaders globally on the antitrust issue of competitor collaboration for legitimate reasons to tackle climate change. Some of you may have seen that there's been concerns expressed by different actors, in particular banks and financial institutions, about the risk under the Sherman Act, and it's very serious because it's criminal associated with these voluntary initiatives. It makes no sense. I will just say this as a competition lawyer that we would actually punish folks that are trying to do right by the planet. This is not price fixing. This isn't fixing marks. This is actually just doing what the science says. So we really need to make progress on that. Good news, UK has clarified. Their commissioner of competition has guidelines out clarifying that legitimate purposes with some criteria attached, where competitors get together and say they're going to do the things that are required for us to be net zero as a planet. In particular, phasing out coal. We need to phase out coal. Like, it's not an aspirational thing. That obviously needs to happen. And that includes moving on fossil fuels generally, that we're going to do that. And the Secretary General is having a climate ambition summit, and he wants to have as many members of the business financial community and cities and regions as possible to be there. There's a price of admission. You need to have a transition plan aligned with the criteria. So with that was a lot. And I know I'm quite I feel like I had a lot of coffees this morning. So hopefully I'm waking everyone up, but really looking forward to a great conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. This was excellent. And I'm really happy that we have such a great panel here today. I want to introduce two other panelists. In addition to Catherine, we have Helen Mountford here, who is the president and CEO of ClimateWorks Foundation. She has over 25 years of global experience at the intersection of environmental action, economic development, and climate policy in her role. And before joining ClimateWorks, Helen was the vice president of climate and economics at the World Resources Institute. And she previously also was the Deputy Director of Environment for the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. We also have Karsten Stendevad here, who joined Bridgewater in 2017 and serves as the co-CIO for sustainability. He oversees Bridgewater's overall sustainable investing efforts, including the design and oversight of investment solutions with both financial and sustainability impact objectives. And before that, he actually served as the CEO of ATP, which is Denmark's national pension plan, where he was responsible for all investment-related activities and chaired the investment committee. Welcome, Helen, Karsten. I'm really glad that you could join here today. I want to turn it over to Helen. So listening to what Catherine has said, based on her report and her experience in working in the net zero space, what are your perspectives on this and your reactions to her remarks?
Thank you so much, Sanjay, and it's a real pleasure to be here and wonderful, difficult but wonderful to always follow Catherine. So many insights there and such excellent work with that high-level expert group report on net zero and ensuring that we are drawing that red line under greenwashing. One of the challenges we often hear from business, finance sector, and other leaders is how do we actually do this? How do we do net zero well? How do we actually make this happen as we make these commitments and need to put in place the pathways and the accountability to show that we're delivering? And the good news is that over the last few years, the think tank, civil society, business community working together has actually rapidly developed a number of the tools, the systems, and some of the standards that are needed to help the corporate cities, regions, investors to set science-based climate targets for net zero, develop the transition pathways and those intermediary targets that Catherine referred to that are needed to get them there, to robustly measure and track their progress, and then to transparently report against this. I'm really pleased that ClimateWorks and the philanthropic community more broadly has really helped support a number of these initiatives to do so. Now, these tools and systems and standards are absolutely essential, both for the businesses and the regions themselves, but also for shareholders and investors so that they can assess the climate-related financial risks or opportunities and actually guide their investments accordingly. Also essential for regulators and for the public to know what's actually happening, what these businesses and others are doing. Now, this ecosystem of tools is really a very rich one and a somewhat complex ecosystem. It includes things like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to measure corporate emissions, which is now used by 9 out of 10 Fortune 500 companies. It includes the Science Based Target Initiative, which is a set of tools to help corporates set rigorous targets aligned with the science on climate change. And we now have almost 5,000 major companies worldwide doing so. It includes GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, with over 550 major financial sector players in 50 regions committed to net zero portfolios by 2050. The Race to Zero that Catherine referred to, with a number of non-state actors committing to net zero. The Carbon Call, which is helping to provide interoperability and sharing information on these. The International Sustainability Standards Board, which is developing standards for sustainable disclosure, the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative, and the ICVCM, Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. I mean, all of these, it's a veritable alphabet soup, and I've missed, I'm sure, a number of the important and critical tools and systems in this ecosystem. But it is, this ecosystem is really critical. And one of the things we're looking at now is how do we ensure all of these work well together to actually deliver the kind of standard, high quality standard that Catherine and the report have really indicated is needed. We know there are some gaps in the system, and some of these tools, even while new, are actually needing to already be updated and upgraded based on what we've seen in their application, and making sure they connect well together. So to me, really, the H-Leg report that Catherine led outlined this gold standard, the North Star of what we need to see from zero commitments by corporates, the finance sector, cities, and states. And then what we need to do now is make sure that all of these tools and systems in the ecosystem are helping support corporates and others to actually do that and to do that well, working across this ecosystem. That will necessarily be a process as we go forward, but it's well underway and we've got the basis, the groundwork to do so. So we're really excited that we can move forward. The one piece, that's all the good news. The good news is we've got these tools, we've got these approaches that can help. We're moving on the right track. We need to bring them together and work towards that gold standard. The worrying news is that the proverbial bicycle tire rubber, if I can say that, bicycle tire rubber is now hitting the road. And so we're seeing pushback on the ambition of these standards and these tools as we move forward, because it's starting to cut. People are starting to realize this has impact. We need to do this. It will have impact. So we're seeing some pushback and we're seeing some division amongst the community. And so one of the things we really need to do now is hold strong, keep advancing, recognizing that we don't have the perfect approaches yet, but we're getting there and working towards that together. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Carsten, I want to turn over to you. You come from the investor community, right? Like where we have seen a lot of diversity of opinions. A lot of investors are trying to commit to net zero. Some are not really in that space. What are your perspectives on this, again, with regard to Catherine's remarks and looking at it from an investor perspective?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and Catherine, for your leadership on this important topic. There's no doubt that irrespective of one's personal belief, climate change is a reality. And so if you're an investor, the first thing you have to do is you have to look at the world and see how is the world working? What's driving the actions of governments, of companies, of consumers? And in a way, you have to take your own emotions and opinions out of the picture and say, just observe what's actually occurring. And already now, it is indisputable that the kind of issues relating to climate change and to the net zero transition is already impacting the actions and choices of governments, of corporates, of consumers. And therefore, it's a reality you have to face. And so I think that's increasingly, I think we see investors all over the world understanding this. However, I think a very important distinction to keep in mind when you talk about the role of investors is really, in a way, the ecosystem of the financial system, kind of who controls the money and who sets the objectives of the money. I think around the world, we have asset owners, we have asset managers, and ultimately the asset owners, they're the ones who set the objectives of how money should be managed. They, in a way, own the capital either themselves or on behalf of pensioners or savers around the world. And if you think about the transition to net zero and how it impacts the objectives one could have for a portfolio, it really can affect a portfolio in a few different ways. It can impact kind of the return dimension of a portfolio. It can impact kind of the risk dimension of the portfolio. And of course, it can also impact the impact that the portfolio has on the world. By and large, most institutional investors in the world, if not all, are strongly focused on creating the best possible risk-adjusted returns that they can possibly have. And so therefore, irrespective of your own views, one has to ask the question of the net zero transition. What does that mean from an opportunity perspective in terms of, are there ways I could make more money? That is the job of investors. And certainly just with the sheer transformation of the global economic system as a function of the net zero transition, there are a lot of opportunities that will be created and things that one has to, as an investor, think about. As you make investments, you have to understand how this will change dynamics in industries and in countries. For example, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States is a very significant piece of legislation. Irrespective of your own views, as an investor, you have to think about that legislation and think about what does that mean for the economic landscape of the United States, and does it create some opportunities? So clearly, every investor has to do that. Secondly, there is a risk dimension, which is often talked about, but climate change could inflict risk on a portfolio. So one, of course, has to look at that also. And there's a whole stream of body of work that investors will do to stress test their portfolio to make sure that they're resilient. Everything I've said so far is very financial in nature, right? It's an investor thinking, oh, are there risks or are there opportunities that I should think about in my pursuit of creating the best possible returns for investors? But increasingly, what we're seeing are asset owners saying, that's not all I want to think about. In fact, I'm not just worried about climate change and net zero's impact on my portfolio. In a way, I need to turn the question around and say, what is my portfolio doing for net zero? In fact, if you look at the Paris Accord, Article 2.1 very explicitly talks about the importance of making, and I quote, making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards a low greenhouse gas emission world. So in other words, the Paris Accord was not so concerned about investors' returns, right? They weren't saying, I hope you will make more money. They were saying, your portfolio has to be aligned with a net zero transition. And increasingly, we see more and more asset owners, in a way, heed that call and make net zero commitments. That's a very different question that you're answering there, because you're not just answering, is there a way I can make better returns? You're actually asking, is there a way that I can explicitly align my capital towards a net zero world? And I would say 5-10 years ago, 5 years ago, you would not have many investors who explicitly spoke in those terms, but that's increasingly what we're seeing. So in a way, in my remarks for the rest of, in this discussion, I will mostly focus on investors who have made that commitment. And because it means a different way of investing. It means, I think, really three things as an investor. an investor who takes a net zero commitment, I think broadly speaking, is making three types of commitments. One is to reduce the portfolio emissions in their own portfolio in a manner that is consistent with what kind of real world emission reductions, right? So you want, in a way, you want the emissions of your associated with your portfolio to go down, but in a way that is not just like you running away from carbon, but in a way that's actually consistent with you helping the world transition. I think that's related to the second point that I think investors who've taken a net zero commitment agree on, is the idea of financing the transition. Financing the transition, meaning, all the new things that we need in order to bring the net zero transition about. It needs capital, and so you want to explicitly direct your capital towards that. Some of that are kind of green things, green tech and others. That's great, but I think importantly, and as Catherine mentioned, it's also directing capital towards entities that are not sustainable today, that are actually high emitting, but that need to improve. And this is one of those, I think, tensions I hope we will talk about, is how do you actually, how do you go on this journey, but not do this in a way what I think is a silly, easy thing of just running away from the carbon emissions, but actually lean into where the carbon emissions are and help the emissions come down, which I think relates to the third bucket of activities that net zero aligned investors, I think, commit to, which is really around engagement. And this idea of saying no single actor can do anything on your own. There's an important role between asset owners, asset managers, and then, of course, the entities that are receiving the capital, companies. And that dialogue and that engagement has to be very strong, so that, in a way, the whole ecosystem is working together towards aligning and helping the world transition to net zero. So I think, just to summarize, I think it's very important to be clear around, not every investor, let's be honest, is actually committed to net zero. There are a lot of asset owners who have not made those commitments, and some who have. So the first intellectual distinction we have to make is, well, what does net zero even mean for example, an entity that has not made a net zero commitment versus one that has? And then for the ones who've made the net zero commitments, to really think in these three terms: reducing emissions, financing the transitions, and in a way engaging with the ecosystem to help it transition.
No, this is a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much. I want to start off with a question that puzzles me as an economist, because we all know that the most efficient way to decarbonize would be to have carbon pricing across the board, right? Across industries, across companies. A lot of these net zero commitments that we're talking about here by corporate actors are voluntary. And so, Catherine, you alluded a little bit to it. We have the often paradox situation where you have corporate actors that commit to net zero voluntarily in public, but then they're part of industry groups or lobbying groups trying to push against regulations, against carbon pricing schemes, against mandatory regulations. And so how do you reconcile these two? Why do we even need the voluntary net zero commitments by corporations? If we just had mandatory carbon pricing across the economy, you could just facilitate the transition without having to rely on these voluntary efforts, which are always hard to enforce.
Well, if I had a magic wand and just could do carbon pricing, we don't live in an ideal world. And I say to everyone, this isn't going to be, I know everyone and Carsten, with all due respect to the financial sector, everyone wants us to be orderly. I know, I get the orderly idea. I mean, maybe it'd be a lot more orderly if we'd all done a lot more 30 or 40 years ago and had carbon pricing. But and I think what Carsten said is super important. A lot of what he said is about just risk, opportunity, and then doing your part. I don't know, maybe that's a way of shortening it, but the reality is it's carbon pricing is hard politically. I mean, it's kind of funny because I'm a progressive, I guess. I mean, I am progressive and I'm with the Liberal Party, and we brought in, I actually went to George Shultz. Everyone might remember George Shultz, rest in peace. He was American Secretary of State under Reagan, and he was actually part of a bipartisan group in the US pushing carbon pricing. There's still a group that's doing that in the US. And he's like, his advice was make it as conservative as possible, make it transparent, give all the money back. So I took that. And so then I thought everyone would love it, right? You're giving more money back. Actually, it's progressive because if you've got a low carbon footprint, because you don't have a lot of, you don't have a big house, you don't have big cars, you don't have multiple properties. But I got slammed by conservatives, right? populists. So it's a hard thing to do. Also, I mean, we couldn't start at where you need to be. And actually, we just did a social cost of carbon in Canada, and I can't actually remember, but it's gone up even more, maybe $300. I should know this number, but I don't. But I mean, ours, the carbon price in Canada, it's across the board price. So it's at the pump as well, but money goes back, more money goes back to people. But I mean, we started at $10. And then we go up to, we go up by $10 every year. So, I mean, we can't get to the price we need to be. So long story short, it's hard. Hard things are hard. And in the US, it's particularly hard. But look at what's happened with the Inflation Reduction Act. That's a game changer in the US. It's a very different approach than has been taken by Europe or even Canada. Canada wants to compete, so we've created more incentives, but we also have a carbon price. So we have to explain to folks in Canada, I'm not in government, but that we have a carbon price, which means we don't necessarily need to have exactly the same incentives as the US. I mean, obviously you need to be thoughtful. But look, we don't live in a perfect world. And I think, though, the other thing to say is that, and I say this because I lived it, the reality is people, we do have people lobbying against good policies. Government, you can't, because I often hear, well, government should just do carbon pricing. Well, governments need to get elected and stay elected. And so you got to do what it takes, and you got to show leadership. But ultimately, all of this conversation comes down to leadership. And so if you are in a place where you can influence things, show leadership. It's not just by, did you meet every criteria standard, like going through that. We actually need people like Helen. We need people like Karsten. We need people like Brookings to actually have these conversations where folks realize, like, it's about making money. It's about managing risk, but it's also about doing our part and also being rational in our approach to what kind of planet we want. So I think that, I mean, that's a long story, but I think that we're going to have an imperfect world where there's going to be a variety of different policies, and no one can just use as an excuse government has not doing carbon pricing, because sometimes I hear that. Governments are trying. I think that border carbon adjustments, we want to go down another rabbit hole. I think that's a good carrot/stick, mostly a stick, but that is also really important. But I think that reality is, if everyone just stayed to net zero and did what they need to do with net zero, including lobbying for positive policies, we actually would get there. And this goes back to elite athlete. Everyone should think like an elite athlete, including business. Where do you want to be? And then what do you need to do every day to win? And winning means, yes, making lots of money, but also, most importantly, winning means a sustainable planet for everyone.
Great, thank you. Then, let me turn to Karsten. If you look at the landscape, especially in the US, right, how do you assess whether a net zero commitment by a corporate actor is actually credible, right? We've seen a lot of, as I mentioned before, a lot of corporate actors that lobby against the regulation against carbon pricing while at the same time committing publicly to net zero. So how, as an investor, do you evaluate what of these commitments are hot air? How many of those, and how many are actually credible? How can you measure that in a standardized way that actually can really move the goal forward? I think that's a big challenge, right? Because we don't really have standards that are the same across the board. And you as an investor have to evaluate kind of like, what are the commitments that are really have a foundation that we know will move us forward.
It's a challenge, but I think it's a challenge that's possible to tackle. Whenever as an investor, you have to make a forward-looking assessment, which is the job of investors, there is an inherent uncertainty, right? You're taking a view on what will the future outcome be, and how does that compare to what's priced in today. And so if you think about net zero and net zero commitments by companies, what we have to do there is to try to come up with our own fundamental way of thinking about what does it mean to be net zero aligned, and try to then compare that in a mental map of what does it mean to be net zero aligned, and then compare that with what you're seeing in the world. So very specifically, we would ask 3 questions of a company, which relating to net zero, and it has to do, 1, with kind of the feasibility. 2nd is really around intent, and 3 would be about actions. What I mean by feasibility is, if you have an industry that's putting up a net zero commitment, and you look at it technically speaking, is there even a feasible technical solution today to this problem? And if the answer is no, all else equal, that makes the commitment a little bit less credible. If on the other hand, you are in an industry where you say, look, it's high emitting today, but there are technical solutions that exist today that we know of that maybe have to be scaled up, or they have to be expanded, that would make so if it's technically feasible, that would make it more credible. There's a financial feasibility also, which is, or some people call it the greenium. Bill Gates called it the greenium, which is the idea of saying, well, maybe it is possible to produce something in a low emitting way, but it may just be very expensive today. And of course, the bigger the greenium, in a way, the less credible it is. So, but both of those topics I would put in the bucket of saying, hey, is it possible technically and financially? The second, I think, question is to say, well, is the company actually committed to this? And there you can look at what the company is saying. Is it like a LinkedIn profile, like with a video of like a vague long-term commitment, or do you look at the quarterly updates from the companies to their investor base, where they talk in detail around these commitments? Again, you see very big differences between industries. Look at what the auto sector is doing. I mean, the specificity of their plans, of their intent is very significant. It enables you, I think, as an investor, to at least come up with a credible assessment of whether we think it's possible or not, which leads to the third question around actions. And specifically, if you look at a particular company, you say, okay, you say this is important, we know technically it's feasible, what are you actually doing today about it? So assessing green CapEx, assessing various types of actions taken today that make the transition path realistic. But all these three things I want to emphasize is, it's uncertain. We don't know. Often the company themselves don't even know. There's a lot of talk about greenwashing, but I think sometimes greenwashing, I think is a bit, sometimes greenwashing, if you say stuff you're not going to do, that is bad. But how about the situation of an actor that's actually generally thinking about this, trying to do it, but is just uncertain? It's just, you don't yet fully know how you make the transition. In my mind, that's not greenwashing, but I think that goes back to any time you're trying to make something in the future where you don't know what you're going to do, you have to be honest about kind of the cone of uncertainty about the outcomes. And the more I think we are in a way honest with each other around what is certain, what is probable, what is just like a pipe dream, I think the better it is. I will end on this point, which is, there has been a remarkable development in the data ecosystem and just the ability for, I think, all of us to engage on this question. So much great work has been done by various types of NGOs, academics, companies themselves. There's a lot of critique around the quality of the data, and it's true. It's not perfect. But I think the question we should ask ourselves is, do we know enough to start moving in the right direction? That's a different question for saying, do we have perfect information? Sometimes you don't need perfect information to start kind of understanding where the world is moving towards and making an assessment around kind of the credible future path of certain things. And I will end on this. Net zero is not the only topic that investors face where there's a lot of uncertainty, where there's imperfect data. At the beginning of COVID, it's not as if all investors say, we couldn't just say, oh, we don't know about this, we don't have imperfect data, ergo we can't deal with it. No, that's not the game. The game is there's a reality in the world and you have to deal with it, no matter if you have perfect information or not. You have to engage with it. And I think that's a bit of the mindset that I think is important, like a can-do attitude, as opposed to all the reasons why I can't tackle this particular topic.
I think you bring up a really good point, which is kind of data and information. I think oftentimes the first step is to actually have that information, which we don't have in many cases, right? We don't even know what the emissions situation is in many industries, in many countries. Helen, I want to turn to you. What is kind of like your take on the relationship between the mandatory regulations and the voluntary net zero commitments from your perspective?
Thanks very much, Sanjay. I mean, I very much agree with Catherine. We want to get to the mandatory regulations. That's essential. It's not going to be one tool. It's going to be a mix of tools. So carbon pricing hopefully will be the base in many countries and regions, but you're also going to need regulations. You're going to need information-based systems. You're going to need various different tools that work together to really deliver this. And what we're seeing on the voluntary initiatives is an incredibly important complement to this and a basis that can actually then lead to regulation later. This is where we've got the companies, the cities, the others stepping up, trialing these approaches. I mean, as Carsten just mentioned and we've discussed, I mean, there's a lot of tools and data and information now available. Not perfect, but it's getting there, and it's getting there through the voluntary system. That will lay the groundwork for what we need for regulations later to actually do this robustly. So there's a strong complement there. I would say on carbon pricing, I mean, interestingly, while there's a lot of debate here in the US or discussion that it's just not going to be possible at the moment at the federal level, the world is moving on this. And if you look at the latest World Bank data, we've got 83 countries or subnational jurisdictions that are applying carbon pricing, either carbon taxes or emissions trading schemes. That includes Canada, where Catherine really led the charge to take on an ambitious carbon pricing system. But the EU, China, South Africa, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, often the prices are not high enough, but we've also recently seen some record high prices in many places. So that's actually moving and shifting. And I believe in 2021, the carbon pricing revenue from these schemes globally added up to $84 billion. So that's not, that's not small change. That's quite significant. Of course, one of the challenges is, as Catherine and Carson and yourself have mentioned, one of the challenges is we have some of the incumbents who are really pushing back, and they're trying to resist the shift, and they're trying to lobby against policies, lobby against moving forward on these voluntary initiatives. And often they're succeeding. And one example of this, to compare to that $84 billion in carbon pricing revenue we've seen, last year, sadly, we also saw over $1 trillion that went to support the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel consumption in terms of subsidies and tax breaks. So governments are trying to put the carbon pricing in place, moving forward on that and regulatory approaches and others. But at the same time, there's still these subsidies and tax breaks, over $1 trillion globally, going to the fossil fuel industry and consumers. And until we get that right and actually reduce those, as well as doing the carbon pricing, we're sending mixed signals. We're sending very mixed signals. And the companies, oil and gas companies, walked away last year with record profits, right? They're getting record profits. They're milking consumers dry, and they're getting these subsidies and tax breaks. So there's a lot in the system. It shows how much pushback we're getting, and how much lobbying, and how successful some of that lobbying is. But there's a lot there that needs to be sorted out.
That's a really good point. I really love that you brought up the point of subsidies, because I think people always forget that, right? The arguments that float out there say, oh, we should not provide subsidies to renewables. They should compete on an even playing field. But we forget that fossil fuels have received subsidies for many, many decades and are still continuing to receive substantial subsidies. And I think that's actually the first step. We need to cut those subsidies and that support. That would really level the playing field more than many other things. That's a great point.
Absolutely. But I'd argue that we do all of it all together at the same time. We can't wait and do one and then the next. We need to do all of this. Absolutely.
Right. And that brings me kind of like a bit to my next question, which is often the devil is in the details and how to execute things, how to actually implement this, right? And so I want to bring two facets up and start with you, Helen. When we look at these net zero commitments per corporations, there are two questions I have. One is, how do we make sure we actually capture the entire value chain? And as an example to our audience, let's assume you have two railway companies. One railway company has electric cars that gets electricity only from renewable sources, but then their customer is a coal company, so they only ship coal. And then maybe you have a competitor who has a dirty diesel locomotives, but they ship solar panels. If you only look at the direct emissions, you would think, oh, the one with the clean energy is the best. But then when you look at down the entire value chain, you see that they're actually supplying all the coal to the coal-fired power plant. How do we make sure to capture the entire value chain? And then the second question related to that is, how do we kind of like make sure that these net zero commitments are enforced? And how do we make sure that companies that make net zero commitments don't say, okay, look, this part of my business is dirty, I'm going to spin it out into a private entity. There are a lot of private companies that don't commit to net zero, as Carsten has said. And then what we end up with is with a lot of publicly traded companies that have made these net zero commitments, that have supposedly clean value chains, but then all the dirty activities, some of which we cannot reduce, as Carsten said, there is not the technology at the moment. They end up in private hands, and we don't really have any way to kind of address those. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on those. Helen, please.
Two fairly quick responses. Those are complex questions. Both of them are complex, but I'll give some brief reflections. I mean, one, on the net zero and the value chain, the good news is, again, with this sort of ecosystem and tools and approaches, we've actually already been integrating that in. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science-Based Targets Initiative look at Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions for corporates and give them the tools and approaches to measure these, to have verification, to be able to go forward. It's more challenging on scope 3, but you can do all. And scope 1 is basically your own emissions as a company. Scope 2 is the emissions from your electricity or power that you use. And then scope 3 is your value chain. It's those who provide goods to you and also your customers downstream. So there are ways to measure and to monitor and to manage these different types of emissions. Again, scope 3 is one that's harder, but there's a lot of progress being made on how to do that and getting companies trained up and able to do so. On ensuring that these targets are enforced, that is really important. We are in a process of still trying to set the pathways, help companies and finance sector and cities and regions to actually set the pathways to develop those transition pathways that are realistic. As Carsten mentioned, you need things that are plausible and realistic. We know that we need to be at net zero by 2050, but what is the pathway? What does that look like for different sectors, different regions? How do you actually manage that? And so there is a lot of focus on these transition pathways and understanding that it's not going to be the same for every sector, and it's not going to be the same for sectors in different countries, depending on what's available in terms of renewable energy, for example, or others. And so there is really a focus on doing that and having the corporates set them themselves and then have them verified by others to make sure that they haven't sort of cut corners. I think what's going to be absolutely essential is then as companies move forward, they set their interim targets, they have their long-term goal, but then as they move forward, transparently reporting on their progress in a way that's harmonized with others so that investors, the public, governments can actually read and understand how they're doing compared to others. So there's, again, a big focus in this ecosystem of how do we harmonize and align around these standards and make sure that they're clear, understandable, and speaking in the language that investors, for example, need or regulators need to be able to help them to do their role.
Great, thank you. Catherine, over to you. What are your thoughts on this? On the value chain and especially on making sure that
on this very large topic of
I know, right?
So firstly, I do want to say something that Helen said. It's related to what Carsten said. The 3 questions, this is what is critically important. We can get into the weeds of what is required, and it's set out in the report. Go read it. It's not that long. It's actually written. We tried to make it comprehensible in English, 10 recommendations. But feasibility, intent, and action. And so I think we've talked about some good actors, and there's a lot of folks in a lot of industries that are working really hard. But I do think oil and gas, we do need to talk about this because 80% of emissions, CO2, come from oil and gas. So we cannot avoid the elephant in the room. And the problem is on all those 3 measures, it's not happening. Look, hard things are hard in life, but if we don't tackle the real problem, and that means all of us, that means governments, that means investors, that means the industry itself, then we got a problem. They are making hand over fist in money and then not investing it in clean, investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure, which we've already said is a problem, and then demanding subsidies while people pay more. That's just completely inconsistent. It also, from the perspective of government, it creates real problems because, of course, you need to deliver for people ultimately. So I would just say, like, that's an example of where actually you can measure this. Emissions need to go down. And that's overall emissions. Yes, intensity is an important measure, but the planet doesn't care so much about intensity. The planet itself, i.e. the atmosphere, it cares about absolute reductions. We need to reduce emissions by half. And money needs to go scale to clean. Now, the good news is that if you start with the asset owners and you go down, they have huge tools to make that happen. Governments have tools. And so, but just on scope 3, I mean, it's not unrelated. Because scope 3, when people talk about scope 3, first of all, it's like the worst term. I didn't even know what scope 3 was when I started this. I was like, why are people keep on saying that weird name? But if you put it is like you're a company, take Walmart. And actually, they've got a great Canadian there, Kathleen McLaughlin. She works on this all the time. She's trying to figure out all their suppliers. Can you imagine how many suppliers Walmart has? They have a 1 gigaton challenge, and they're working with their small suppliers. Like you could say, well, everyone's scope 1 is someone else's scope 3. Everyone's scope 3 is someone's scope 1. I hear this all the time. First of all, most people are just like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But the idea that I don't have to worry about someone's emissions that aren't mine, it's up to them. Well, if you're a small producer in Colombia or something, you actually need assistance. And so there's a real opportunity, and this is what Walmart is doing. I'm just picking one example. And are they perfect? No one's perfect, but they're trying to support the emissions down their value chain, which if you said eliminate their scope 3, their actual emissions are not very big. Their direct and indirect emissions are very, very, very small. So it's not very hard to do that. I'll put it like that. When you talk about the financial sector, I don't know, Carson probably has the answer, but like, if you're talking about scope 3 emissions for financial institution, it's like 95% of the emissions, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's higher, I don't know, it'll depend, but we're not really talking about the buildings, the bricks and mortar of the financial institutions, or even the energy they use, great, work on that. But finance emissions are really important. How you decide to invest your money makes a massive difference on whether we're going to be able to achieve net zero and reduce emissions by half. That doesn't mean it's all on financial institutions, but that's why this measure, like we've seen different ways of framing it, but say 4-to-1, money needs to go from it to clean versus dirty. We're not there. We're not even close to that. Some banks and financial institutions are further ahead, but being thoughtful about these things, because what I say to folks is it's actually not that hard. Emissions need to go down, money needs to go up at scale, and then we need to think about people, workers and communities, and of course, clean energy in Africa and financing that. But I think if we're all just disciplined, we can do this. Because sometimes we get into, well, it's not really fair, scope 3, and like all of these things, like we just got to do the work, folks. All of us have to do the work. There's no excuses, and hard things are hard. But as I say, the reward is amazing, but also what I think is, I know everyone wants certainty, but there's no certainty in life. And the reality is, if you had said in 2015 that governments would be saying only electric, we'll say electric vehicles by 2035, only clean electricity by 2030, people would have thought you were bonkers. We weren't even talking about net zero by 2050. Canada made a long-term commitment to reducing 70% of emissions by 2100, and we thought we were a leader. The world is changing so fast. The economic opportunity is so large. The risk, both the risk of transition, the risk of stranded assets, but also the risk to your own business and your business model is huge. So I think that's what we also need to be thinking about. Once again, it's about measuring everything that matters, but it's also about leadership. It's about people talking about this so people actually understand, because I think there is a misunderstanding about risk, opportunity, and how fast the transition is going to be. And then there are interests who are very strong, who lobby against us and make us make bad decisions or create the wrong incentives that fight the right incentives.
Thank you. Over to you, Carsten. Very briefly, since we're coming up to the end, what is your take on the implementation on kind of like the entire value chain? And I want to also bring up a small question from the audience here that is very related, which is an audience member asked, most companies don't calculate forward-looking emissions, only their current footprint. Without that information, how can an investor know if the investment will bring them closer to net zero? So I think that goes to the question of enforcement and of making sure that we actually adhere to those net zero commitments. Closing words to you.
I think there's a theme here around not striving for perfect information before you'd make common sense decisions. So, for example, in the example you use, Sanjay, around like a company that has like one part of the business is sustainable, one is not. You know, sometimes it helps to try to reduce these complex questions to simple questions. Like, for example, for a company, if you ask, forget about scope 1, scope 2, and all the technical terms, and you just ask two simple questions. Let's look at what the company does, and let's look at how they do it, right? Those are two simple questions. And you look at a company, and if you spoke to your grandmother who was sitting next to you, and you say, look, are those two reasonable questions about a company? I think she'd say yes. And then you say, okay, so now you don't have the annual report, but now I'm explaining to you this profile of this company. This is what they do. What you often find, not always, but often you find like some of those corner cases that people get all tied up in knots around, while in this statistic, it looks good, that statistic, it looks bad. If you step back and you say common sense wise, where is this company like net zero line today or not? You actually often can find a pretty reasonable answer to that. Now to the question about the forward-looking assessment, you're exactly right that, Sanjay, from our perspective, the ideal would be the following. A company gives us an externally validated, legal commitment to doing something by 2030, like reduce as much uncertainty as possible. That would be wonderful. It'd be great. We're not there. Like that's not what they're going to do. So in the absence of that, you have to come up with some type of assessment. By the way, when you look at earnings of a company, companies don't give like a legal, like they don't give us this perfect certainty around what will happen with earnings in the future either. Forget about sustainability or net zero. And so at the end of the day, what we have to do as investors is you have to make a reasoned assessment with your own logic that says, what do I think is a plausible future outcome here? And you will be wrong sometimes. In fact, for sure, there'll be situations where an investor who wants to commit to net zero is going to invest in a company that has high emissions, that made all kinds of commitments, and in 2 years will realize, you know what? They just changed their mind. Either they failed or they just changed their mind. In fact, this year we've seen a couple of high-profile examples of some companies who had made pretty big commitments and then realize, you know what? Actually, I think that's going to be a bit tough. I'm changing my mind. That will happen. That's reality. And so I think what we have to learn there is to say, okay, but you do best effort basis assessments. And then you watch along the way, you engage along the way, and you, by and large, the thing that we're trying to do is to shift the system towards an outcome, not with perfect near-term precision, but if the super tanker can start moving in that other direction, that's what we're looking for.
No, these are very good closing words, I think. We are unfortunately out of time, although I would love to continue that conversation. I think we could talk the entire day about it. I would like to thank all three of you, Catherine, Helen, Carsten, for spending time here today. I know your time is very valuable, but I think you brought up really valuable and great insights for our audience, and I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.